What's up, fellow gamers? Phreak here, and we got the Balance Manifesto for Path of Exile 3.17. I spent the greater part of the day running over the actual math of what's going on and doing a bit of learning about how all the abilities work because I haven't played every ability in the game. Certainly not to a very high level, so there are still going to be some level of assumptions here because I just don't know everything about the game, but overall I think a lot of the numbers are going to hold up. Now, I already saw in, it's now the top comment of the Reddit thread about the Balance Manifesto, someone went and did the basic math on how much damage the abilities are doing. This is going to do a couple of steps more than that, and so hopefully it's something useful for you. So basically, I'm going to be covering most of the topics of this manifesto, but not all of them. So the first big thing they're doing is they are making hit-based spell casting better. So the idea being that self-casting for a hit, like saying, I'm going to go ahead and just cast Arc and cast Arc and cast Arc, or Crackling Lance, or whatever else, that's supposed to get a lot better. As maybe compensation, they're going to keep a lot of things about the same. So if you're casting these spells as a spell slinger, it's not going to get much better or it's going to get worse. If you're casting these spells as traps, it's not going to get much better or it's going to get worse. If you're using these spells as totems, it's not going to get much better or it's going to get worse. If you're using these spells to deliver ignites, it's not going to get much better, and in a couple of rare cases, it'll get worse. I don't know why you would have like a totem ignite build, but theoretically, if you're going to do it that way, that would also be bad. So essentially, any ability where your ability to recast the spell is important, those mostly all got buffed. I'm sure there are ones they didn't hit. I'm sure there's things that aren't actually improved, but there were 20 to 30 some odd skills that got directly buffed from a hit perspective, so we can talk about what happened to that. Alongside this, they had a couple of other interesting changes, like Orb of Storms became a better, like, individualized, I put this down and I use it to deal bonus damage. We'll talk about that when it comes down to that one. They're specifically calling out something like Ice Spear, which I find very strange because Ice Spear didn't get any specific buffs. Flameblast and Lightning Tendrils, I mean, maybe. And then they also deleted a bunch of Threshold Jewels or made them really, really weak. So in the case of deleting Threshold Jewels, in some cases they a compensation buff the skill. In some cases, they didn't do enough, in my opinion anyway. And for the ones where it, for example, made your spell go in a ring, so like Ethereal Knives and Spark, you still have a threshold jewel for the ring size, or it casting in a ring instead of in a line. But those threshold jewels all lost their bonus projectiles. Unleash support got nerfed. It was the single best build for self-cast in any reasonable level of cast speed for the most part. I have a data table on that. We can talk about that one as well. It's still pretty good as far as I can tell. And again, as I mentioned, they're making converting spells to totems and traps and mines a little bit weaker, and we'll talk about that overall. Ignite does 28% less damage, and then we'll go through the rest of the little things. So we're not really going to cover hit-based bow attacks. I felt like there was too much going on there for me to cover it effectively, so we're going to skip this one. We're going to talk about the sources of added damage, where basically the flat added Cold Lightning Chaos support gems are getting weaker, but flat added Cold Lightning Fire, etc. on weapons, both for attack-based builds and for spell-based builds, got buffed. We'll talk about which one matters more when it comes down to it. And that's most of it. I think there's one more thing. Oh yeah, we can talk about Detonate Dead very slightly. We can talk about Seismic Trap very little bit. So let's go in order. Let's talk about all of the glorious changes to the hit-based builds. So here you go. Here is our gigantic data table. So on the left-hand side is basically every single skill that got directly affected, all the way down here to Fire Burst, which, yes, is in red, meaning it didn't do very well in the patch. So what happened here? Well, a couple things to talk about. Number one, GGG seems to be targeting for an added damage ratio of 560 added damage, doubles the damage of the ability. This was the mean number across every single skill we saw in these pseudo patch notes, and seemed pretty reliable. So in some cases, like for example with Fire Burst, the like added damage required was in like the 300s, and so that got brought down as the base damage went up, so that it was back to like around 560. There were a few cases, like for example, Holy Flame Totem and Shockwave Totem, where they didn't actually get their added damage buffs in. And I think those are just mistakes in the patch notes that they should have been there, but whatever. Anyway, so most hit-based builds went up about 50% in damage. We can go down. This is the entire column here of every ability that was directly buffed. And you can see the vast majority of them were 140% or better, 40% more damage or better. So if you weren't using Unleash and you're just a simple self-casting character, you were getting, in some cases, in a lot of cases, 50% or more damage. That is substantial, right? They just straight up buffed self-casting by 50% more damage. That is a lot. That is a really, really big deal. That is one of the heaviest swings I have seen for, let's be fair, an archetype that doesn't exist right now. No one plays self-cast arc, except to ignite people, which is what the second column is for, is how much ignite damage is going on here. Now, Lightning Tendrils is special because every fourth Tendril just is going to wallop for 3x damage, and considering I'm expecting ignites to last long enough that you're just going to use the big Tendril for ignite, the big Tendril actually has 165% ignite modifier. So Lightning Tendril Ignite is maybe, I don't know, maybe a build. I don't know if it really is, but theoretically, there's the math there, right? We'll talk about Unleash in a little bit. For now, you can see that the number is actually still pretty positive, that even if you are playing an Unleash sort of setup, you're probably going to be okay. But yeah, anyway, all these abilities for self-cast seem pretty solid. I don't know if Blade Fall is really a great self-cast build, but there it is. Obviously, we have abilities like Blade Vortex and Blade Blast, where it's not really the exact same kind of self-cast play style, so, you know, we kind of just leave those up. Even Crackling Lance, which is like pretty much unplayable, 44% more damage. Okay, great. We talked about the ones that didn't get very much. Viper Strike is an example of one that actually got buffed because of the Threshold Jewels going away. So Viper Strike lost its Threshold Jewel, which gave it some increased damage modifiers, which were pretty relevant, but also it lost the ability to get Unholy Might for free, which is 30% more, or 30% Fizz gained as Chaos, unless I'm misremembering something. It's relatively difficult to get Unholy Might. Obviously, you can acquire it, but suddenly Viper Strike just like lost an almost 30% more damage modifier. That seems pretty meaningful. So Viper Strike probably is in the dumpster, and it is probably unplayable, as what I can tell. Toxic Rain got nerfed by a flat 17% dot. That's a really big deal. 17% less damage dealt. Not goodbye Toxic Rain, but it means things are going to live 20% longer. That's pretty meaningful. Toxic Rain was the most played skill. Makes sense to nerf it by 17%. Anyway, they had a set of skills that they said were specifically Ignite-based. So we've got this crew right here. There are the traps and totems, where indeed the upfront damage of things like Explosive Trap and Ice Trap and Blade Trap just went up by a solid 40 to 50%. Fire Trap's dot went up 42%. Fire Trap's flat damage went up 36%. Again, counting the 560 bonus damage. So, by the way, to finish on that thought, because I realized I didn't finish the thought before, the idea around 560 added damage doubles the damage of the ability. What I'm essentially doing to just genericize the math on all of these abilities is I'm going to assume you have 560 added damage from sources somehow. Now, maybe that is slightly overstated, but it doesn't really matter because across all these abilities, it's very close anyway. All I'm really doing is saying the added damage ratio is as important as the flat damage of the ability. Again, the wiggle room here didn't change much across abilities. We're quibbling over 1 to 2% if you kind of disagree with the methodology. Only situations like Fire Burst where they really, really got hit, where Fire Burst used to really, really care about added damage, and now it doesn't anymore. Did that one really get hit very hard? Otherwise, again, we're seeing relatively decent numbers across the board. So, once again, talking about this, so yeah, Explosive Trap, Ice Trap, Blade Trap, Fire Trap, and Lightning Trap all got 40 to 50% more damage. If you account for the Ignite changes, because Ignites do 28% less damage now, okay, they're about equivalent to maybe slightly better. Again, Holy Flame Totem and Shockwave Totem appear to be in a very, very bad spot. Not even just counting the fact that they didn't get, in the patch notes, buffs to the flat damage, but they also didn't get really large buffs in the first place at all. So these maybe look a bit underpowered and probably will be so, unless there's bigger buffs on the way to talk about down the line. As far as the Ignite focus skills, Vaal Burning Arrow, Regular Burning Arrow, Armageddon Brand, Death Wish, and Fire Burst, they're relatively similar. Worth noting that Armageddon Brand, technically this is like 39 or like 99.6%. It technically lost some DPS, but they basically slowed down Armageddon Brand's hit frequency. But since it's bigger hits more or less frequently, obviously the Ignites are still better. So Armageddon Brand is as good or even better of a League starter, being the fact that it actually gained Ignite DPS. Now, maybe the reliability of it triggering is actually valuable, and maybe that does slow it down, but Armageddon Brand clearly doing pretty well. Burning Arrow doing just fine. And yeah, the rest of these, I mean, yeah, not amazing, but whatever. The Fire Burst, by the way, this 108% is if you have no flat added damage at all, then the Ignite DPS is up by 8%, same as Armageddon Brand. But considering Fire Burst got slowed down and got its added damage functionality nerfed, I mean, look, the numbers went directly down, but then also, ratio-wise, they got worse. Fire Burst is arguably a weaker skill. We'll see if that ends up being true long-term or not, or if there's things that are kind of missing from this analysis. Okay. So let's go back to the main skill point thing, because basically we have the TLDR is there's very little change in Ignite DPS. If you're playing an Ignite-based build, the Ignite-based builds aren't very different. If you're playing some self-cast Ignite build, like maybe you're playing Elementalist Ignite Arc, again, you're looking at, 3 to 8%, maybe in some really high cases like Ethereal Knives or Freezing Pulse, 20% more damage. I don't know if you're going to play Freezing Pulse Ignite, but theoretically it's a possibility here. Anyway. Okay, let's move off of Ignite for now. So now we're going to move on towards these parts, which is the idea of Unleash being nerfed. So we're going to scroll all the way down to the Unleash project that I did, which is here. So as far as I can tell, I did the math correctly. There's always a chance I did something wrong. I'm human after all. But basically, what are your casts per second? And what did that mean for the damage out of your Unleash support skill gem? What did it change for you? So for example, if you have all 3 seals and all you do is cast spells every 5 seconds with Unleash stacks built up, well, you actually do 25% less damage than before. Instead of getting 3 instances of 71% more damage or something like that, you get 3 instances of 51% more damage, whatever the numbers actually are. I think this was like 79% more, whatever. But yeah, turns out if you're only doing hard burst with Unleash, you're getting 25% less damage. That is obviously pretty meaningful. Now, I think a reasonable point to tag yourself to is maybe 2 casts per second. 2 casts per second seems like an okay spot to be. Now, keep in mind, at a certain point, right, if you were at 3.2 casts per second before, this was kind of the limit of when Unleash was valuable. If you're playing it as a consistent DPS thing, like you're going to just DPS check, I don't know, Shaper for a long time or whatever, then, in long-term DPS, all it was doing was giving you 35% more damage, which means it's kind of replaceable by any other support gem because they usually add about 35% more damage. This was kind of the lower limit, or the upper limit, I guess, of cast speed that you're probably willing to use Unleash on. I mean, there's some wiggle room because obviously you still burst the very first one, but then you're still doing this for the rest of the time. So this was kind of the lower limit. And, if you were using it at 3 casts per second before, you lost 10% of your damage, which, like, I guess. But in the real world, going up to here, and keep in mind, right, that instead of using this nerfed Unleash, you'll just use a different skill gem that probably gives you 35% more damage, and you've got a replacement, and it's not so bad, right? So we're even here slightly overstating the real impact in the real game because you're going to replace it anyway. But here is kind of the point where you would use new Unleash, where it does get nerfed, and you're casting only twice per second. That's a relatively fast cast speed, but obviously you can go much faster than this if you stack cast speed. There's going to be actually more sources of cast speed on rune daggers and jewelry and whatnot. So it's very likely a lot of builds, especially with moderate investment, are going to get well beyond 2 casts per second, and in which case we're often going to be off of Unleash then. We're probably just going to get off that skill entirely. But hey, if we're at 2 casts per second, Unleash is still valuable. It's a 36% more damage modifier, as we scale towards infinity time casting spells, and in that case, it's 13% weaker. So we're somewhere between 25% weaker, 13% weaker, or 10% weaker. Somewhere around, these numbers is where we're actually living with Unleash support. That's around where the nerf actually is. That's basically the math. I think it's going to be reasonably accurate. Somewhere across those numbers is what the Unleash nerf actually is for us as players. So here is, once again, our data table, right? Here is the worst possible Unleash. This is, right, we take our big burst damage increase. Ethereal Knives is 65% more damage. Isn't that great? But if all we ever do is a 3 seal Unleash cast every 5 seconds, well, we only do 24% more damage. That's still a strict buff to our character. It can't get any worse than this. And even if we go down to things that didn't get a whole lot, like Blazing Salvo is kind of the worst suited of all these buffs, down here only got 43% more damage. It's still 7% more damage as Unleashed Blazing Salvo, not to talk about all the other stuff we got, like increased cast speed and other gear slots. So it seems to be that this was a strict buff, even to like being hard bound to Unleash. Now, if we are going to cast only 2 times per second, and we are kind of pushing towards infinity, spell casting, and so we're getting a diminished value out of Unleash, and it's just better than the next better support gem, then this 65% increased damage Ethereal Knives is a 44% more damage Ethereal Knives. Arc, which is sitting at 49% more damage, is 130% more damage. If we're using Unleashed Arc in a more reasonable game state where we're not going Ignite, we are going crit, we still gained 30% more damage. So it all looks pretty good overall. It looks like we're actually pretty solid, and it seems reasonable. So then, of course, we could trigger our abilities, right? And so this column is a 70% damage support. So what we have going on here, and let me try to find it real quick, is it off to the side? It is not. Give me a second. I know where it is. It is this. It is this data table right here. Okay, so a bunch of what I'm going to call trigger abilities got nerfed. Basically, these are all the non-self cast stuff. So the actual trigger line of text is Mjolnir, Cosprey's, and the third one that lets you cast spells every 0.15 seconds. It's been nerfed to every 0.25 seconds. So instead of casting instead of casting 6 2/3 times per second, we're casting 4 times per second, and so we're only doing 60% as much damage. Now this assumes that you have exactly perfectly orchestrated your hits per second to exactly trigger on the right time. That is pretty unlikely. If, for example, we're always 500ths late and we hit every 0.3 and 0.2, suddenly it's a 1/3 damage decrease. Now, is that fair either? No. But, it's not always 6% worse. It's 6% worse in kind of the worst of cases. The less frequent the trigger, the more forgiving not being perfect is. As a DPS loss. So again, you could never really get 60% less. And yeah, theoretically, if your character hits exactly on the right tempo, you change none of your gear, and now it's 0.25, now it's going to be awkward. Like, yes, that is possible, right? Like, things can get weird, but on average, it is not quite a 40% less damage modifier. Still, though, a very large nerf, and arguably the biggest nerf of this patch overall, is that Mjolnir lost 40% of its damage, especially if the things you're casting with Mjolnir didn't get any better. Now, that said, Ice Spear and Arc were two of the biggest Mjolnir skills. Well, maybe not so much Ice Spear, I forget, whatever. Either way, Cosprey's was a big one, Mjolnir with Arc and whatnot, right? Those things all did get buffed, and so even in this like 40% less damage case, it's still pretty close. The Mjolnir build didn't really change that much. Anyway, though, we have the other ability. So Arcanist Brand actually got hurt the hardest, only doing 68% of damage. Spellslinger does 31% of damage. And here, by the way, I'm tagging. I went to Poe Ninja. I looked at every build where Spellslinger support was used, Arcanist Brand support was used. Well, it's not a support, high impact mine, etc., and said, okay, show me 5 link skills that had 10% use case or more, and I wrote them down. So Detonate Dead and Volatile Dead, Detonate Dead got nerfed very lightly in that you're not guaranteed to spawn a ton of specters, right? You're guaranteed that 15% of your corpses are specter corpses, and people were like, oh, we're saved. Detonate Dead doesn't seem too horribly nerfed. It's like, but it appears like Detonate Dead is a Spellslinger situation, and Volatile Dead is a Spellslinger situation. It lost 31% of its damage because Detonate Dead and Volatile Dead didn't get buffed. They lost 31% of the damage because they were Spellslinger. So guess what? These damage abilities got stealth nerfed. And I mean, they're pretty overt about it, but they didn't say Detonate Dead specifically. So unless I'm really trolling on how the math is actually done, and it might be, right? If it turns out that Spellslinger only nerfs the damage of the skill, but the corpse explosion part doesn't care about Spellslinger's damage reduction, then there's no nerf and we're good. But I don't know, so one of these is true. Eye of Winter, by the way, was the other relatively common Spellslinger build, and Eye of Winter didn't get compensation buff, so Eye of Winter got hit really hard for Spellslinger. High Impact Mine got nerfed to do about 30% less damage. Eye of Winter was the primary High Impact Mine ability. Here's where we got the Seismic Trap Exsanguinate nerfs, because there were nerfs to Seismic Trap. It's basically going to overlap less, so your single target damage is going to be a bit worse than Seismic Trap. Your overall clear is going to be better because it's going to spread out more, but your single target is going to suffer for Seismic Trap. Exsanguinate got hit by multiple trap support, or its other option, cluster trap support, getting nerfed by about 30% of its damage. So Exsanguinate is usually tagged to one of these two skills, and whichever one it's tagged to, it's losing 30% of its damage. So Seismic Trap's Maps Clear got nerfed by 30% of its damage. So in the manifesto, when they said Seismic Trap's doing too well, they nerfed Seismic Trap. People were like, it's fine, Seismic Trap's okay. It got hit a little bit, no big deal. It's going to overlap less, it's still fine. 30% DPS off your Map Clear. Now, you might just Seismic Trap for Map Clear because that got a little bit better for its AoE coverage. That's possible, but it's a cooldown focus trap, so hey, by the way, right? Now, maybe you're not going to play multiple traps. You're going to find a different skill to use, and you're just going to, rely on Chain and Fork and whatever, and you're still going to be okay. But ultimately, instead of throwing down 3 traps at once, you're throwing down 1 trap at once, and that's a pretty big deal, right? Instead of throwing down 3 traps that do 70% damage, aka double damage, from one support, which seems really, really good, and lo and behold, it is, you can throw down 3 at 50%, which is 1.5x damage, which is probably still your best support. But by the way, right, you kind of unavoidably lost 30% of Exsanguinate Trap's damage. Battle Mage's Cry wasn't very popular, but lost 30% of its damage. Intuitive Leak was basically just on Aurabots, lost 30% of its damage. Cast on Crit, which again would go on a bunch of things. Ice Spear, Frost Nova, Eye of Winter, And Frost Nova and Ice Spear did get buffed. Eye of Winter did not. Maybe it's missing from the patch notes, but Eye of Winter did not gain more damage, so it has been strictly nerfed in as far as cast on crit builds are concerned. Cast when channeling, we're using General's Cry and Blade Flurry. This is basically using Cyclone to get Desecrate spawns, and then just casting Blade Flurry and General's Cry. Those were not being cast during cast when channeling, so functionally these skills didn't actually get nerfed. Cast when channeling is seemingly is only being used, aside from Whispering Ice, is seemingly only being used to like generate Desecrate corpses, and so the damage nerf doesn't actually matter here. But if you're going to cast when channeling something, don't. It already wasn't like a primary damage skill, but it got nerfed, so don't bother. Blast Chain Mine was a common support for something like Eye of Winter, Fireball, and Arc. So Blast Chain Mine, Eye of Winter, Blast Chain Mine, Fireball, Blast Chain Mine, Arc, those are probably dying, so goodbye to those. I could talk about Cluster Traps with Exsanguinate. Awaken cast on crit is just more of the same. Again, it lost 30% of its damage. Spell Totem only lost 20% of its damage. Now, the primary Spell Totem build is Freezing Pulse. It seems that GGG was aware that Freezing Pulse was losing its Threshold Jewels, and people really only played Freezing Pulse as either sometimes like a weird cast on crit channeling thing, but really reliably it was just a Spell Totem build. Most Freezing Pulse players were playing Hierophant Spell Totems. There were a couple of very small exceptions, but it wasn't the common build. And so Spell Totem got nerfed less than other ones. Keep in mind also, Soul Mantle got nerfed. We'll talk about that in a little bit as well. Right, that's also part of it, is Soul Mantle doesn't give you +1 totem, so Spell Totem support isn't going to take quite as big of a haircut as it used to. That's only 20% damage nerf instead, so we'll keep that one in mind in a little bit. And then, finally worth pointing out, that Trap support got an 11% less damage modifier and lost its 38% increased modifier. Now, if you don't care at all about 38% increased damage, then it's just an 11% damage nerf, 80% of damage dealt. But I built out a little calculator, and here we go. So the more increased damage you have, the less you need the increased damage from trap support. And so here's the calculations. And we kind of stopped here. We stopped at 180% increased damage because that felt good enough to me, because we beat the competition at that point. Now, a lot of players are going to get well more than 180% increase. And in fact, if we want, we can just drag this down for a while and say, here, just give me a page of it, right? Like here. Just hook me up, right? Hook me up to 400% increased damage. Okay, so what are we really losing out of trap support? Well, if you have no increased damage at all, you're actually losing 36% of your damage compared to before, because you needed the 38 on the support gem, and you wanted obviously the 11% less now on the support gem is a big deal. But considering that most of these were 30% less damage, we're getting that with 40% increased. If you have a baseline increased damage of 40%, aka your gems are qualityed, or you have a passive tree at level 10, you've got 40% increased damage. So trap support is necessarily nerfed less than 30%. Obviously, never less than 11%, but even as we go higher and higher and higher, I mean, we can keep scaling this down, right, until, we go to something absurd. But like even at 800% increased damage, we're still looking at 15% less damage from trap support. So, pretty meaningful damage difference. Like, this does matter. So just by the way, right, like this is meaningful. We did lose some damage that is, to some degree relevant. So, hey, keep that in mind, right? Trap support lost, in realistic terms, I would say 20 to 15% of its damage. I think that is a reasonable way of putting it. That trap support lost 20 to 15% of its damage. Hey, by the way, remember Exsanguinate? Remember Exsanguinate Trap? Yeah, so Exsanguinate Trap does 20% less damage because of this and 30% less damage because of this. Yeah, it hurts, right? Like, what's, 1 times 0.8 times 0.7? Yeah, Exsanguinate Traps do half the damage they used to pre-patch. So Seismic Trap got freaking destroyed, right? Because that's how they cleared. So they got to find a new way to do this, right? They have to find a new physical trap to clear with, because they're scaling generic fizz a lot of times, right? They're scaling trap damage a lot of the time, and yeah. So that build got hit real hard, right? Like, did you see that manifesto and say, oh yes, Exsanguinate Traps lost 44% of their damage? Because they did. All right. What's the next thing to talk about here? What else do we have for data tables? Yes, we have the totem stuff. Okay, so I mentioned the totem stuff, right? We're going to scroll back down. And again, we only lost about 20% damage from spell totems. So let's do this part of it. So let's say instead of casting Frostbolt and Incinerate and Ice Spear by ourselves, we want to use totems to cast them. Well, that's totally reasonable to do. So what do we have going on here? Well, if we're just playing exactly one spell totem, like we're just playing a character, and we decided that, you know what, I'm casting Ice Spears, but I want to put a, like I want a second 6-link that's also Ice Spear, but it's gonna have a spell totem down. Now that's a little awkward, but bear with me for a second. Well, if you're playing spell totem before and you're playing spell totem after, if you're gonna have a lightning tendril totem that's gonna channel all the way full, then great, it's gonna do 44% more damage. If your lightning tendrils are not gonna ever get the bonus damage, it's gonna do 20% more damage. But we're getting a solid 15 to 25% more damage for most abilities with Spell Totem, because the base damages went up by 50% or so, and the Spell Totem made us do 20% less damage, and the result is we do 18% more damage on average, and that's pretty reasonable. So okay. At first glance, Spell Totem builds got up 18% damage. And to be fair, people weren't playing totems for anything except, I guess 2 patches ago, we were doing Forbidden Rite totems. Those things were just absurdly overpowered. But yeah, okay, these totems are a bit better. Well, hold on a second. Because if you're playing a Spell Totem build, you were definitely playing Soul Mantle. And so the most totems you could have playing Soul Mantle, unless you're doing some kind of weird Iron Commander Ballista kind of build, but outside of Iron Commander, your actual totem cap was 7 totems, unless there's some kind of corrupted implicit, but I don't believe there are any. So this was 1 for you, 1 for Ancestral Bond, 1 for Hierophant, 1 from Soul Mantle, right, which is going away, 1 from a Shaper Shield, or like Tukohama's Fortress, or something to that effect. Like there's a couple of offhands you can do that have it, and then 2 for multiple totem support. And then as far as I could tell, players were always going for multi-totem support, that it was always worth it for them, and that even though getting a Shaper Shield to get 16% more damage, that wasn't worth it. A second wand for more spell damage was better than 60% more damage as a slot, so people tended to actually play 6 totems. So people actually played 6 totems, but they're not really going to play 6 totems anymore. They're going to 5 totems because guess what? Soul Mantle got nerfed. And so this is the world spell totems actually live in. So if you're going to play one of the really buff skills like Frostbolt or Ice Spear, you've got 102%, 108% Freezing Pulse, 108%, basically Freezing Pulse and Ice Spear as they live right now, which are the only things people actually spell totem. They went up a very, very small 2 to 8% damage. That's not bad. That seems reasonable. It's okay to have 2 or 8% more damage. You got a nominal buff to Freezing Pulse totems and Ice Spear totems. There's an asterisk in my voice if you can't tell, so stay tuned. But yeah, for pure boss DPS, Ice Spear totems arguably are strictly buffed. Now, there's a couple of really small things you can talk about. The fact that multi-totem support means you put 2 totems down at a time. So instead of going 2, 4, 6, you're going 2, 4, 5 and replacing the first one. That is maybe worse for you. I'm not really certain. That said, if all you were doing was putting 2 Freezing Pulse totems down and walking away, well, those 2 Freezing Pulse totems are doing 30% more damage, right? If you're not hitting the totem cap anyway, if you're going to 2 or going to 4 and then piecing out, that's strictly buffed. It's 30% more damage and 30% more damage and 30% more damage. It's only when you were going to hit the totem cap, that's when you started to fall off. So it's actually a little bit better than it looks like on paper, and that is really, really worth mentioning, because when you're clearing trash mobs with Freezing Pulse totems, you're not putting 6 totems down, right? You're not. It's not how you're playing this one out in almost any case. So, just to keep in mind, there's something going on there that's not quite as bad as you might think. It's not going to be quite as punishing. Okay, but, certainly a relevant thought to think about. Alrighty, so what's going on here? What else is going on here then? Well, if we were, maybe we weren't going to play with one of these tools, right? We actually have 5 max totems in total. Which is, I don't know, it's me with Ancestral Bond. It's me who's a Hierophant who's running multi-totem, and I'm not running Ancestral Bond, and I've got a Soul Mantle. Now, that's really unlikely, right? That's really unlikely to happen, but that's how we would get. That's how we had 4 max totems in the old version of the game, and how we get to, 5 max, how we go from 5 to 4 max totems, basically, in a reliable situation. I guess technically, if you're going to also run Ancestral Bond, Hierophant, Soul Mantle, and a Shaper Shield, that's +4 equals 5. If you weren't going to play multi-totem, actually, that's what this is, really. This is really if you weren't going to play multi-totem, but you were going to run a Shaper Shield, and you were still running Soul Mantle, this was your data table, which means, by the way, that if you weren't running multi-totems, you're basically just strictly nerfed. In any boss DPS situation. What this means is if you weren't running multi-totems, Spell Totem is worse. Spell Totem already wasn't very good, or at least not very popular, so they're really, really balancing this around using multi-totem. This is an even more extreme case where we are only running 4 totems, where it's just like me, Ancestral Bond, Hierophant, Soul Mantle. We're not running multi-totem at all. We're not running a shield. Again, worse. We're really, really, really not doing this. So they are strictly nerfing any realistic non-multiple totems build, which is okay. And again, for boss DPS. Like, that is a meaningful asterisk that for boss DPS, it's getting nerfed. Or for boss DPS, yeah, it would get nerfed if you weren't running multi-totems. Again, for generic clear, put down 2 totems and leave, put down 2 totems and leave. That's not nearly as bad, and in some cases, just strictly buffed. That said, though, we had some changes, okay? So Threshold Jewels went away. Some were really meaningful, some were not nearly as meaningful. Let's talk about it. So Ethereal Knives, its Threshold Jewel still makes the knives go out in an AoE. However, it no longer gives bonus projectiles, which means baseline Ethereal Knives went from 10 to 13 projectiles, but EK Nova went from 15 down to 13 projectiles. There's a reasonable case that we just play regular EK now, and maybe it's fine. I don't know. I have no idea what this playstyle is like, but hey, if you're playing regular old EK, it actually got a very, very large buff, right? It got a 65% increased, 65% more damage buff and 3 more projectiles. Seems good. Maybe it's playable. I don't know if it's playable, but that's a really, 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 really big buff. I remember doing this kind of video for a last patch, and I'm like, wow, they really, really, really buffed Seismic Trap. And Seismic Trap became the meta. So when you see a buff this big, maybe consider it. Lightning Tendrils, of course, similarly, again, gained 65% damage. Actually, in some cases, 82% more damage if you can perfectly get to all 4 charges every time. And then it gets a bit worse. So both Freezing Pulse and Frostbolt gained about 65% more damage, which is really, really big. That's really, really nice. As we talked about from before, in the case of Frostbolt, right, if you lost 30% of your damage from Spellslinger or Cast on Crit being worse, you're still doing 15% more damage than before. So Frostbolt is still nominally buffed, right? Could look pretty good, right? The problem is both Frostbolt and Freezing Pulse, they lost their +2 projectile threshold jewels, which means that for 2 jewel sockets, you could have gotten 4 more projectiles. Now, that is actually a really, really big deal. I spot checked on the top of ladder, looking at any Frost Pulse builds and any Freezing Pulse builds. Basically, all of them ran their threshold jewels. They really considered these the plus proj to be really valuable. To my understanding, they don't shotgun, but just getting the clear is really, really useful. It makes it really good. And so it was really worthwhile. Now, this is doing some basic math. So in general, as a vague rule of thumb, a jewel socket is worth about 5% more damage. That's just about how it lines up. I spot checked a couple of builds. It's pretty accurate. It's not going to be perfectly accurate, but it's pretty accurate. That instead of running a threshold jewel, you can run a different jewel that gives you about 5% more damage. Okay, why are you telling me this? Well, let's say you want to get the 4 projectiles back, because you can't get it from a threshold jewel. In the case of playing for totems, you can get Rain of Splinters, which is going to change things around a little bit. You're going to get like 80% reduced damage ultimately as a result. Like, it's going to change around things a little bit. But ultimately, how do we get the 4 projectiles back? Well, we could unsocket a more damaged support gem and socket greater multiple projectiles. And so if we do that, the ability got buffed by 65%. We lose 35% from the support gem. We lose another 30-ish percent, 26% from GMP. And we gain 5% more and 5% more from our 2 jewel sockets back. And if for some reason we wanted to self-cast +4 projectiles Freezing Pulse or +4 projectiles Frostbolt, we do 99% as much damage as we used to. Now, no one played self-cast Freezing Pulse and no one played self-cast Frostbolt. Just saying, if you wanted to reach that, you'd have to do that. Now, if you're going to put them in totems, you have to put on another 20% less damage modifier, which means out of the box, trying to get GMP Freezing Pulse back up, you do 20% less damage than previous patch. Seems not great. So there's a decent chance that Freezing Pulse totems are dead, because that's going to be a really, really tough look. Now, that said, if your clear was already too good, okay, great. A lot of Freezing Pulse totem players were just swapping Ice Spear in for bossing, and Ice Spear just tends to run GMP anyway because it works well that way. It just shoots multiple projectiles. It ends up shotgunning. It's pretty decent. But as far as I can tell, this doesn't seem great. So Frostbolt and Freezing Pulse appear to be pretty rough, unless you really, really didn't need the projectiles that badly. I mean, ultimately, you're never going to go for the plus projectiles again. It's just not worth it. There's no way you do that. But, you know, maybe with Rain of Splinters it's enough. Maybe with Dying Sun it's enough. Maybe with just other ways of getting multiple projectiles it's enough. But it, you know, doesn't look amazing, right? We had a change to Spark's Threshold Jewel as well. The base projectiles went from 7 to 8. The Threshold Jewel, though, no longer gives bonus projectiles, so the Threshold Jewel for Arc Goes Out in a Ring went from 9 down to 8. So, hey, you know, Spark got strictly buffed, right? If you're going to self-cast Spark or even play Spark Totems, you know, to a certain degree, yeah, Spark Totems are arguably better. More projectiles, more damage. I'm not saying it's a build you should play, but it is stronger. And so that covers the Spell Totem side of things. And once again, Viper Strike, yeah, lost the access to easy Unholy Might, and so is possibly quite dead. Now, we talked about there were some Ignite changes, right? All these abilities got changed. We also had a different set of abilities that had their more damage modifiers changed. So here is Penance Brand. Penance Brand, the way it works is as it's on someone, it builds up stacks of energy, and the more stacks of energy you have, the more damage, I think, with ailments it does. And so it was a way to get really, really big ignites. And so here is the data table. Essentially, after the ignite difference, the first 5 stages of Penance Brand is doing less ignite damage than before. From stage 6 onward, or 6 stacks of energy and onward, it's doing more ignite damage than before, to the tune of, I mean, you know, up to at most 5% more damage. But again, your early ignites are going to be a bit weaker. Now, again, ignites are going to override as soon as they're stronger. So as long as Penance Brand lives on your target long enough, okay, there you go. But just again, the breakpoint is that if all of your Penance Brand damage comes from stage 6 and higher, then okay, you're probably fine here, and Penance Brand maybe got strictly buffed. Next up is Vaal Flameblast. Had to look this one up because I've never played the skill. The way Vaal Flameblast works is instead of you channeling it, you just put it on the ground, and it just triggers every so often, dealing a bunch of bonus damage. And so it triggers at the end of stage 3, 6, 9, 12, and 15. I might have an off by 1 error here where I'm actually doing this. It actually triggers like at the end of 2 or like at the start of 4 somehow or something. So like maybe these numbers are very, very slightly off, but the base damage of Vaal Flameblast is going to be unchanged because the base damage doesn't go anywhere. But as far as the more damage of the ailments modifier going up, and then multiplied against the fact that all ignites deal 28% less damage, here is your actual ignite damage of Vaal Flameblast, and it's up. Vaal Flameblast is overall a stronger inclusion into your builds. As bossing damage, Vaal Flameblast is up, you know, 5 to 10% damage. Cool, right? Now, again, the first explosion does nothing bonus, but the second explosion does more, and it gets, you know, better and better and better from there. And keep in mind, right, like most of your damage actually going to come from this, so there's actually more math that one could do to add all these together, do a bigger comparison, and it's like, no, the entire Vaal Flameblast is also up about 9% damage, assuming you can get all 15 stages to hit, right, all 5 explosions to deal damage. But yeah, clearly pretty meaningful here. This is a strict buff to Vaal Flameblast, at least the Ignite version of it. It's, I think, flat for the hit version. But again, you know, something to include here, right? Vaal Flameblast, you know, clearly pretty worthwhile for an Ignite build. All right, what else do we have to talk about here? I believe we talked about all the Ignite changes. We had a couple other Threshold Jewels that got hit. Ground Slam has +4 to its radius now. It lost Endurance Charge on stun and 50% angle on its Threshold Jewel. You tell me if you think +4 radius is better than plus angle. I couldn't tell you for sure. I'm not sure which one's better, but like, hey, by the way, this is the trade-off. But again, also, you know, the other option is you get 2 passive slots, 2 passive points, or a jewel socket worth about 5% more damage. So, you know, it's, you know, +4 radius, plus 5% damage, and other stuff. Heavy Strike. Its double damage is now more inherent to the ability. So we lost 20% double damage on the Threshold Jewel. We gained 19% double damage on the ability, which means it does 99.3% as much damage. Heavy Strike. Heavy Strike's double damage. Yeah, Heavy Strike basically does the same damage before and has a freed up jewel socket. So Heavy Strike does 5% more damage than before. Heavy Strike got strictly buffed, basically. Cleave now gets an innate +2 radius. It also does 4% more damage. But you no longer have the Threshold Jewel, which gave you 10 to 50% increased, I believe, duration of Fortify or effective Fortify, I forget what. But it also could give you 1 to 10 radius on Cleave based on how many enemies are nearby. So the radius is only +2 now. And so not only do you do 4% more damage because the spell does more damage, but you have an open jewel socket, so another 5% more damage. So Cleave does about 10% more damage, but you get less radius. Glacial Hammer Now just fully converts 100% of all its damage to cold automatically. I believe people tended to run, I don't know if actually they ran 1 or 2 threshold jewels for Glacial Hammer. First things first, if you ran only 1, you were at only 85% fizz to cold conversion, which means you had to get something else going on to convert the rest of fizz to cold. If you ran both, you go to 100% conversion. However, get a free melee splash gem by running a threshold jewel, only the first version counted for that. All the cold damage from your strike splashed. And so if you didn't convert all the way, you only had 85% effective splash. And if you ran 2 jewels, you weren't getting any extra benefit out of the second jewel. So, okay, we're losing splash, but we're getting 10% more damage from 2 open jewel sockets. Now, melee splash the gem is probably not worth 10%. Having to run melee splash the gem is probably worse than 10% more damage. But hey, if you were going to run Glacial Hammer, I don't know. Here's a thought, right? Arguably it's a nerf, but it's not absurdly so. Depends on how good your clear feels, and probably not go to that melee splash, but again, I don't know for certain. But that's kind of the rundown of all of the threshold jewels. I believe that covers everything that we had happen here. So then we had one more self-cast thing, which was Orb of Storms. So Orb of Storms, as a baseline, does 67% more damage. Every lightning kind of tendril that comes out does 67% more damage, which if the lightning tendrils are going to ignite, if you're going to run Orb of Storms Ignite for some reason, and it's going to be your strongest source of Ignite, your Ignites are 20% more damage. Now, I don't think Orb of Storms Ignite is a build, but if it is, it's 20% better, which is actually the best Ignite buff we've had in the entire patch. So, hey, maybe, except for Lightning Tendrils Ignite, which feels weird to play a Channeling Ignite build, but maybe, I don't know. Elementals are weird. I don't know what to tell you. But Orb of Storms Ignite is technically 20% more damage. Is that going to matter? Probably not. Who cares? Let's move on. However, because Orb of Storm's innate hit rate for putting it down went so much slower, it only does 2/3 the damage it used to. So Orb of Storms as a fire and forget, just here's a source of damage, have fun. It lost, it's 33% less damage. That's a really, really, really big nerf. However, the way Orb of Storms works is it will always cast an extra tendril every time you cast a spell in its area. So as long as you put an Orb of Storms down and then start spamming Arc or spamming whatever while on your Orb of Storms, it's gonna shoot out for 67% more damage, which is a really, really big deal. Orb of Storms is substantially buffed for that use case of it's a more damage modifier or it's a flat damage addition. Let's go do cool stuff. It is a lot stronger for that. And the break even, by the way, is 5 seconds per cast. Basically, if you get 1 or 2 lightning tendrils out per Orb of Storms from you casting, it is as good or better than old Orb of Storms. Realistically, in any given case, Orb of Storms, you're going to cast at least 2 spells within its region while it's alive, so Orb of Storms is strictly buffed, and the idea of having Orb of Storms as an extra boss DPS skill seems kind of interesting, right? The idea of playing double 6-link, let's say, for example, self-cast Arc and self-cast Orb of Storms, off we go, right? Like, maybe it's actually really, really dank, and Arc plus Orb of Storms lets me kill Cirrus, and that's a really interesting idea. So I really do believe, based on numbers, that playing something like Lightning Tendril, actually, Lightning Tendril probably has really, really abysmal map clear, but like, what's our Shock Nova, probably too short range. Spark, maybe okay. Maybe Spark map clear kind of sucks. I don't know, but it does have more projectiles. Storm Call, maybe. Arc, 50% more damage. So self-cast Arc does 50% more damage. And then I plop down an Orb of Storms, and I cast Orb of Storms alongside Arc, and that's 67% more damage. And I've got some really good DPS here. That's worth 6-linking both gems, maybe. Maybe. I don't know for certain, but it's a possibility, right? So seems neat. As you mentioned, Toxic Rain got hit pretty hard. And I think that covers Orb of Storms pretty well. I think there's something else to cover right here. So now we go into the last section that we're going to talk about. Just going to double check there's something else I'm missing here. Let's go to our last section, which is the idea of nerfing the flat added damage skill gems. Support gems. So added Chaos, added Cold, and added Lightning all got nerfed. I didn't choose the Awakened versions because the number's going to be closer to the same anyway, that I don't really care. But essentially what it comes down to is, as we mentioned, right, abilities tend to want 560 damage to double the damage on the abilities. So, functionally, we can 1-to-1 by say that, the base damage of our example ability is 560. That's relatively true. The base damage of our example ability is going to be, 560 functionally for this perspective. So it used to deal this damage, or it used to deal this damage, now it deals this damage. So our average damage went from 772 to 752. That means instead of added Chaos being a 38% more modifier, it's a 34% more modifier. Where we've seen this before, this is the target number that they always have, right? Like there's a reason the numbers all target 560 because 34% more damage is the target number of support gems. Like that is what GGG targets for, generically no drawback support gems to give you is 34% more damage. And here we are. Now, what's worth noting is that this, 38% more damage, which I find a little surprising, is that this continually fell down and fell off a cliff the more flat damage you had. So if you had flat added fire on a wand or on a staff or whatever, or on a ring or whatever, these quickly became not 38% more damage, but it does mean that these are going to more quickly fall off, especially for spell-based builds. Because, that's kind of where the numbers line up. It's a little bit different for attack-based builds, but for spell-based builds, with no investment, they're 34% more damage. Assuming they're level 20 of the gem. Of course, level 21 of the gem, it's even better. There's an argument that maybe these actually scale with levels a bit better than something like Concentrated Effect does. I'm not certain. But anyway, what this means, though, is barring any other changes, a skill that was using added chaos, added cold, or added light is doing about 3% less damage. Not a huge deal, but again, we're losing about 20 flat damage on our abilities as a result. Well, GGG, in their, I think, intelligent wisdom, buffed flat spell damage on, for example, this is the two-handed weapon, flat spell damage. So if you're going to use, for example, wand plus shield, the buffs aren't quite so good, but if you're using staff or if you're using two wands is actually better than this. So using staff is actually a midpoint here. Two wands is better, one wand plus shield is worse. Here we are. And so it was buffed, right? It was buffed very substantially. So while where added cold, added chaos, added light got nerfed by about 20, added fire, added cold, and added light gained 25 to 35. Worth noting, by the way, that added lightning is easily the highest flat damage additive in the game. It's true for attack, for like local damage on weapons. It's true for spell damage as well. And from what I could tell, there wasn't really a discernible difference between the flat added damage scaling for lightning skills and the flat added damage scaling for fire or cold skills. So it seems as though lightning skills actually really, really like flat added damage because their mod pool is actually better. Their mod pool is actually better for this. So definitely something to kind of consider for a little bit. It's a possibility. As you can see here, added light as a spell also. We can see this actually got a lot closer together. It's kind of interesting to note that now added flat chaos and then added flat cold and then added flat lightning are actually the best in descending order skill gems. If you are completely agnostic to damage type, you get a little bit more out of added chaos, a little bit less out of added cold, and the least of all out of added lightning. It's a random thought, didn't really know it, but hey, it's there. But it kind of led into argument to like why people were going, flat added cold or added cold as a support gem, because it was so much better than other sources of flat cold, right? Where it was really quite weak beforehand. In fact, right, like flat cold on weapons is still the worst possible option. You can see here that, right, added lightning gives you 198, added fire gives you 138, added fire for spells gives you 110, and added cold gives you a flat 100. So right, it is still the worst mod, but you could argue that simply added cold is useful for its own reasons anyway. So again, here's the flat damage difference, right? Again, 25 to 35 damage, a multiplicative difference of 4%, of like, hey, if you're running this, if you're running just like a one-linked fireball and you had, flat added spell damage on your staff as tier 1, what happened? Well, your overall fireball is, 4.4% stronger. So there you go. So cool beans there. This does make up for the change. It means that flat added spell damage as a prefix is very, very good and really worth chasing down because it's going to be a really, really good damage add. Right, as a more damage modifier, for example, it's 19% more damage. I think this is on screen. No, it's not. I can scroll over. Here we go. Local fire, local cold, local lightning is a 20%, an 18%, and a 25% more damage modifier. These are pretty good mods, right? One mod is this much damage. Again, this assumes you don't have flat damage from other sources, which of course you might, but yeah, these are really good, right? These are really good sources of additive damage, of more damage. It's arguably more damage, but obviously there are other things that do scale linearly with it, but it looks pretty good. Then we have local added damage for weapons. So it was actually just running elemental damage on weapons. This is, by the way, using a Vaal Greatsword as our option. I just picked an example two-hander. I picked the single highest per hit two-handed weapon and said this is our example. I don't think Vaal Greatsword is the common thing used, but I don't care. It was just to put a number down so we had something to relate to. And yeah, the overall damage of the weapon goes up about 5 to 6%. And of course, everything else is going to attack faster or have less total damage. So if you're looking at maybe any of the faster attacking weapons, it's going to look better. If we're having slower attacking weapons, like, you know, really heavy mauls, it's going to be a little bit worse than 5% in some cases. But yeah, elemental damage mods got 5 to 6% better. Local physical mods also got a bit better, right? We now add another 4.5 damage for tier 1 flat fizz. That's not bad. That's going to get multiplied by quality. It's going to get multiplied by percent added fizz. And so, you know, these, you know, 300% increased weapons in total are adding another 12 to their base damage. And considering they're normally attacking, you know, 1.5 times per second, we're adding 18 DPS. So congratulations, you know, we've added 18 DPS to the top end physical weapons. Is, you know, do we need 1100 to become 1118? Not really, but the numbers are going higher. Just a little bit, right? And again, flat added elemental got buffed by a lot more, which I think is pretty wise. And yeah, looks pretty solid here, right? This seems pretty reasonable to do. So, you know, no complaints here. All right, is there anything else to talk about with this one? I don't think so. I believe this covers everything from the patch notes that I felt really comfortable covering. We know that bows got buffed by even more than this. I could have looked up like what old bow mods gave and compared to the new ones and whatnot, but that just felt a little bit excessive. But certainly, yeah, flat elemental damage bows are going to get a bit stronger and all that kind of stuff. So it looks pretty fun. I think this is the rundown of the manifesto. Hopefully it was enjoyable. There should be bookmarks in the description if you want to kind of revisit any other segments, but seems like some pretty cool notes. Again, Exsanguinate got hit really, really hard. We can kind of just like do a quick TLDR rundown of what actually happened here. Basically, yeah, self-cast spell damage went up by between 45 and 65%. Perfect Channeled Lightning Tendrils got buffed by a ton, by 82%. Using generic spells as Ignite actually got overall a bit stronger. In most cases, Ignite got stronger outside of things like Holy Flame Totem, Shockwave Totem, and Fire Burst. In other cases, self-cast Ignite got stronger in every case that I can see. Outside of things like skills that didn't get buffed. So like if you're going to play, I don't know, Stormbrand Ignite, I don't know why you would, but like that's not as good. FYI, right? But otherwise, yeah, things got better kind of across the board. Toxic Rain got nerfed by 17%, and Exsanguinate Traps got nerfed by 44%. That's kind of the big TLDR there. That's the big thing, right? Is Toxic Rain got hit really hard. Exsanguinate Traps got taken out to the shed. I think Freezing Pulse and Frostbolt got hit really hard with the projectile nerfs. As you no longer have Threshold Jewels, it's going to be tough to get back. Spark and Ethereal Knives might be pretty good, actually, via how much damage they actually gain. So this could be actually really, really neat. And I think Viper Strike got hit really hard by losing easy access to Unholy Might. As far as the other Threshold Jewels, there's an argument to be made that Ground Slam, Heavy Strike, and Cleave maybe got a little bit better because you free up the Jewel socket and the actual damage dealt isn't too bad. Glacial Hammer probably to get actually nerfed, and that's going to be painful for our Glacial Hammer friends. But that's the video. Thanks for watching, everyone. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.